The intensity of combat during the Second World War was unlike anything the world had experienced before, not simply because of higher casualty numbers, but because of how completely war had evolved into a system that consumed everything it touched. Earlier conflicts had been brutal, but they were still constrained by limits of production, communication, ideology, and reach. By the late 1930s and 1940s, many of those limits no longer existed. At the core of this escalation was the full maturation of industrial warfare. By the time World War II began, industrial economies had learned how to convert raw materials into weapons with ruthless efficiency. Steel, oil, coal, rubber, and human labor were all organized into tightly controlled systems designed to feed the front continuously. War production was no longer an emergency response. It was a permanent, central function of the state. This meant that battles were no longer shaped by what armies could afford to lose, but by what their industries could replace. Entire divisions could be destroyed and rebuilt. Aircraft losses that would have crippled air forces in earlier wars were absorbed as routine. The result was a willingness, sometimes a necessity, to fight at levels of violence that would previously have been unthinkable. Commanders planned operations, assuming heavy losses from the outset. Technology magnified this dynamic. Firepower increased not incrementally, but exponentially. Artillery became faster, more accurate, and more destructive. Barrages could last days, saturating entire regions with explosives. Automatic weapons turned short encounters into lethal storms of fire. Anti-tank weapons evolved rapidly, forcing constant adaptation and escalating arms races between offense and defense. Air power, in particular, transformed the nature of combat. Aircraft were no longer auxiliary tools, they were central to strategy. Control of the air meant freedom of movement on the ground and vulnerability for anyone who lacked it. Bombing campaigns reached levels of scale unseen before, not just supporting ground operations, but deliberately targeting economic systems and civilian morale. The sky became a permanent battlefield. Cities were attacked not because they were near the front, but because they powered the war effort. Rail yards, factories, power stations, and housing districts were all drawn into the conflict. This removed any meaningful separation between soldiers and civilians, deepening the sense that the war was total and unavoidable. Mechanization further accelerated the pace and violence of fighting. Tanks and motorized infantry allowed armies to move faster than ever before, collapsing traditional defensive concepts. Breakthroughs were no longer local events. They could trigger the destruction of entire fronts. Encirclements trapped hundreds of thousands of soldiers at once, turning campaigns into massive, high-intensity struggles for survival. Speed itself became a weapon. Units that failed to keep up were overrun. Retreats turned into routes. Commanders were pressured to act quickly, often committing forces before fully understanding the situation. This urgency increased risk, chaos, and casualties, but it also became central to success. Ideology added another layer of intensity. World War II was not fought as a limited contest between states, but as a struggle between worldviews that framed defeat as existential. Nazi racial ideology, Soviet revolutionary doctrine, Imperial Japanese militarism, and the Allied narrative of defending civilization all cast the war in absolute terms. There was no room for compromise, only victory or annihilation. This worldview reshaped behavior on the battlefield. In many cases, surrender was discouraged or punished. Prisoners were mistreated or killed. Civilians were targeted not as collateral victims, but as components of the enemy system. The war became personal, moralized, and radicalized, especially in places like Eastern Europe and the Pacific. Racial and cultural dehumanization intensified violence further. Enemies were portrayed as subhuman, treacherous, or inherently dangerous. This made restraint appear naive or even dangerous. Violence escalated because brutality was believed to be necessary for survival. The concept of total war ensured that societies themselves became engines of conflict. Governments controlled economies, labor, media, and education. Propaganda reinforced the idea that sacrifice was not only necessary, but virtuous. Entire populations were mobilized psychologically as well as physically, creating pressure to fight harder, longer, and without hesitation. Civilians' suffering fed back into military decision-making. Bombed cities, massacres, and mass displacement hardened public attitudes. Each atrocity justified retaliation. Each loss demanded compensation through victory. The longer the war continued, the harder it became to stop because the cost already paid demanded meaning. Military doctrine evolved rapidly under these conditions. Early failures forced armies to adapt quickly or face destruction. Combined arms warfare, integrating infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and air support, became essential. Success depended on overwhelming force applied at decisive points. Caution became dangerous. Aggression became doctrine. This learning process itself was violent. Mistakes were punished brutally. Entire armies paid the price for outdated thinking. As tactics improved, so did the efficiency of killing. Battles became more lethal not because soldiers fought harder, but because systems of warfare became better at delivering destruction. Geography expanded the intensity further. World War II was fought simultaneously across multiple continents and oceans. Each theater demanded resources, attention, and decisive action. Leaders feared that weakness in one region would cascade into disaster elsewhere. This created constant pressure to maintain maximum effort everywhere at once. Logistics made sustained intensity possible. Rail networks, shipping fleets, pipelines, and depots allowed armies to operate continuously. When logistics worked, violence could be maintained indefinitely. When they failed, collapse was sudden and catastrophic. Entire campaigns turned on supply shortages, making logistics a silent but decisive force in shaping destruction. Psychology played a crucial role. The trauma of World War I haunted leaders and populations alike. Many believed that another long, indecisive war would destroy their societies from within. This fear drove early escalation and extreme measures. Ending the war quickly, even through unprecedented violence, was seen as preferable to prolonged suffering. This logic culminated in actions that redefined the limits of warfare. Strategic bombing reached its peak. Entire cities were destroyed, not for immediate military gain, but to break the enemy's capacity and will to fight. Toward the end of the war, atomic weapons were introduced, representing the ultimate expression of total war logic. By that point, the war had become self-perpetuating. Nations had invested too much to accept anything less than total victory. Political survival, legitimacy, and memory were all tied to the outcome. Leaders could not afford restraint without risking collapse at home. World War II thus became a cycle of escalation driven by structure rather than choice. Industrial capacity enabled destruction. Ideology justified it. Technology accelerated it. Total war normalized it. Fear ensured it continued. The result was a conflict that pushed combat intensity beyond historical precedent. It erased cities, shattered societies, and permanently altered how humanity understood war. World War II was not just more violent than previous wars, it was different in nature, revealing what happens when modern states unleash their full capacity for destruction without limits. What followed was not peace as it had once been known, but a world permanently altered by the knowledge of what modern war could become. The destruction of World War II did not simply end with ceasefires and treaties. It left behind a deep awareness of how far violence could be taken when industrial power, ideology, and total mobilization were combined. Cities could be erased, entire populations could be drawn into conflict, and the line between battlefield and civilian life could vanish entirely. In the aftermath, nations rebuilt, borders were redrawn, and new political systems emerged, but the memory of total war lingered beneath it all. Military planning, diplomacy, and international relations were reshaped by the fear of repetition. The scale of devastation witnessed between 1939 and 1945 became a reference point, an unspoken warning of what the next war might look like if it were allowed to escalate without restraint. Peace still existed, but it was cautious, fragile, and shadowed by the understanding that modern war, once unleashed, had the power to consume the world itself. If you appreciate restored historical footage and stories like this, make sure to subscribe to History Safe. Your support helps keep these rare moments from the past alive and accessible. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and share it with others who love history. Every interaction helps History Safe uncover, restore, and bring more forgotten footage back to life. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more incredible history.